This week on the Deep Leadership Podcast.
I just think we have a lot of other things we go to first. And what I wish people would go to is the communication and the working with other humans first. John, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Oh, I'm excited to meet you, and really congratulations on this great book that you wrote and
Mhm.
about leading change. And that's what I want to get into. But before we dive into the book, tell us about Team Catapult. What do you do? What's your focus?
Mm. We like to say, I think very succinctly that we exist to inspire the practice of collaborative leadership. And we do that a lot through this notion that we talk about of helping leaders and their teams access collective intelligence. Like, I think that there's so much that exists within and between us that we oftentimes just sort of discount and pass over. So, um, yeah. And what I want to say is, as we were coming on to just doing, chatting before we came on, you talked about how your purpose of this podcast is to help leaders. What did you say?
Yeah,
Build a better.
building a world of
Yeah.
better bosses. Yes. Yeah.
Yes. And I say we often talk about helping leaders do less harm.
Mm.
So we're quite aligned in that space. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you just mentioned collective intelligence or collective wisdom. I always say the collective wisdom of a team is much better than just one manager
Yeah.
sitting in a corner office. And I think I learned that as a young 32-year-old plant manager, the youngest plant manager in this manufacturing plant's
Wow.
history. And I had no idea what I was doing. And so I depended on the collective wisdom of a team. And I
Mm.
learned how the value of it, but I did it because I needed to. And actually learned
Hmm.
a valuable lesson, not by the fact that I was smart. It's just that I was young and inexperienced, and so I needed that. And
Yeah.
so it's a valuable
Yeah.
lesson in leaders who are listening in. If you haven't tapped into that collective wisdom of your team, that's where all the answers are. So you don't need to hire a consultant. All the answers
Yeah.
are within the four walls. So
Yeah.
great. I love your mission. I love what you're working on. Again, we share a lot of the
Yeah.
same vision and concerns for leadership. So I want to talk about your book. It's called Build Your Model for Leading Change. Leading change is such an important
Mm.
topic for leaders nowadays. And I have to say, it's impressive. It's one of the most impressive books that I've ever seen. We've
Mm.
had a lot of guests on the show, a lot of authors on the show. This thing it's a beautiful book. There's so much in it. What
Mm.
was your inspiration to write this book?
I think I've watched, so many leaders that we work with, and leaders that I know and I observe, and you just pick up any, drop in on any newscast, the news is full of different leaders. I watch leaders wanting to have something different happen in their organizations, knock it off on the stock market, launch a new product, even down to, we want to do things differently or we want to change our culture. We're noticing something that's happening in our organization. So I watch leaders set visions, and then I also watch them sort of fumble at the execution of that. And so many times, and I certainly can find this in my own history of leadership too, I think we go to tools and processes and what's the legal thing that we need to put in place, what's the new process we need to document. We go to the hard artifacts or the things that we can create, and we don't look at how we communicate with one another,
Mhm.
how we engage with one another, just like you were sharing your story of, learning to lean on your team and ask questions. I think leaders, just because we have lots of sort of mental models of leadership, and some of them don't serve us anymore, particularly in the world of knowledge work and leading other humans. Um, I just think we have a lot of other things we go to first. And what I wish people would go to is the communication and the working with other humans first. And so that passion is really what drove me to create the workbook. It's based on, so a lot of the work that we do is based on the theory of structural dynamics. It was developed by a researcher named David Cantor. He started that work back in the 70s. And it's basically a theory of face-to-face communication. And so that theory sort of sits underneath all of the work that we do. And the workbook is designed to help leaders identify challenges that they might be having with team members, change that they want to have. I say basically one of your key indicators is if you keep having the same conversation over and over again and you just find yourself really tired of that, that's a good indicator that there's something that might be happening in your communication. And so the workbook really exists to sort of sit alongside that journey.
I absolutely love it. I think it's one of the, I say in my books that leadership is a people business. And so part of
Mm,
the way you motivate people or, get them to do difficult things is through communication. And communication is such an
yeah,
important element. And I think there's so much difference between what we as our intentions as a leader and what the receiving end or what our employees hear us say on a regular basis. There's a big gap there. And I
yep.
think even with the best intentions, we miss out. And it's almost like the marketing thing I learned, running manufacturing plants, is that it's almost like
Mm,
marketing. You have to say it 7 times in 7 different ways to get the message across, because not everybody's busy, everybody's doing things there. So
yeah,
I think when they recognize, when John says that 7 different ways and 7 times, then he's serious about this particular topic, right? So
yep,
it's like communication is not just one and done, and if you do that, you're missing out, I think.
yeah. I
Yeah.
think there's also a bit, you talk about the gap. I think one of the biggest gaps that I see is the gap between intent and
Hmm.
impact.
Yeah, yeah,
And,
yeah,
if you've ever given someone feedback, hey, when you did this, like it really, it got in our way, or it was really, cramping up our style in terms of delivering and performing. And the person's response can sometimes be, well, that wasn't my intent.
yeah,
I think that we need to own
yeah,
both
yeah,
our intent and our impact. And I think a lot of times the gap is there's there's difference between those two things. So
yeah,
it's hard to
yeah.
hear.
Yeah, I often tell the story on a submarine. You would give an order, like I'd be on the
Mm,
bridge and I give an order, left full rudder, steady course 180. And then I would turn back and look to see that the rudder was turning the right way and we were moving in the direction I said. So we're
yeah,
verifying that
yeah.
the person heard what I
Yes,
said,
yes,
understood the message, and is actually complying and doing it in the right
yes.
way. In the civilian world, we don't do anything like that. We say something and we hope it's understood.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah,
Or we make assumptions
yeah,
that we think we know what someone was saying or thinking. And I think that, yeah, I think that trips us up a lot too.
yeah, yeah. So in your mind and in your book and what you talk about, what does it mean to lead change, and why is this an essential leadership topic?
Well, I certainly believe that at the core of any change that we're trying to lead is that communication is the foundation. So I think there are many other things that we need to take care of. All of those processes and tools that we need to put in place, yes, all of that's helpful. But my point of view is that if we don't start with communication, we're not starting off on the right foot at all.
Mm,
So I see leading change as a focus on growing what I call growing your leadership range, your behavioral repertoire, and we'll all have, there's thousands of instruments out there that can help us assess our personality or what style we have. I helpful again, but not particularly useful because they don't help us sort out what's actually happening in our communication in the moment, real time. And then, like, what are the words that I'm saying? How does that land for you? What's my behavioral range? And how can I stretch that range in order to create the conditions that actually will lead to the best, most sustainable change? But it's really going to start with the foundation of you and I being able to engage in dialogue. Like,
mm,
can we bring both inquiry and advocacy into the conversation? And I think we do really well, particularly in American business. I think we do really well on that advocacy line. I think we often struggle collectively on the inquiry line.
mm. So what does inquiry look like? You mean being
Mm.
curious, asking questions, and
Yeah,
seeking feedback? Is that what you're talking about?
yes. Like I see many leaders who, even if they have the skills of inquiry, they get sort of trained by their culture of what a leader or their mental model of what a leader's supposed to do. And a leader is supposed to be setting direction. And when something really difficult comes up, the leader's supposed to have the answer. We have a lot of those mental models. And if you think about how you would respond to those assumptions that I'm supposed to have the answer and I'm supposed to know, then it's going to set you up to advocate for things a lot more. And it's not that we don't want leaders to advocate. We also want leaders who can step back and go, I'm really not sure.
Mm,
I'm noticing that this is a challenge. I'm noticing that this is, really getting in our way. And so I'd like to hear from others. What are you seeing? I don't always necessarily need 75 different ideas. What I need is people to comment on what they're seeing. What do they notice? And that to me is what inquiry looks like. Or when someone says, I think this isn't going to work, and they offer up a challenge or they push back on something, a lot of times leaders can take that as a threat, like, my ideas being discounted. And instead, I think the goal is, can we inquire into that? Oh, fascinating. I make up. I haven't been on a submarine. I have worked with I spent a number of years working with leaders in DoD though, at the very beginning of my career. And I make up that there are lots of opportunities, even in a submarine where there's rank and hierarchy, to be really curious about what other people are seeing so that it informs, how you're making that decision. So I think it's about, a balance of bringing both advocacy and inquiry into the conversation and noticing patterns when we do and don't do that.
yeah. To me, I think it's more, if you want to make better decisions, you need other data points. And I think
Yeah.
being a curious individual, I think a couple of things. One is you get more data points. You can hear
Hmm.
different perspectives. The second thing too is you give your people a chance to have a voice. And I
Yeah.
think we often, especially I've been, leading people for 30 years. I do
Mm,
know the answer in a lot of cases, right? But then I'm stepping on the toes of my younger employees and giving them a chance to get
yeah.
their perspective, right? So
Yeah.
I think sometimes I hold back nowadays because I want people to have a
Mm.
voice and I want to hear what they have to say, even if I know the answer already. And I think
Yeah.
that's something I've noticed is that, and the other thing too is sometimes I have people want to go down a certain direction, which I've already done that, been there, done that, and I kind of
Mm.
know that it's not going to work. But I also if I have an opportunity, I'm going to let them try that and learn on
Yeah.
their own, so I
Yeah.
don't have to jump in front of them and say,
Yeah.
don't do that. I've already tried that. They never get that
Mm.
chance to learn. So sometimes I let people just go with things that maybe I know might not work out, but it's okay because I want them to learn. So I
Yeah.
think it's just having that ability to sort of be curious, seek feedback, and give people a chance to have a voice.
You're growing other leaders,
Yeah,
right? Like
yeah,
it's sort of that ripple effect of when a drop of water, hits into a pond, like you're having that impact of, I call it leading from behind, like in your
mm,
leadership range. I think there are places where we need to get behind and follow or support what others are putting forward. And I love what you say about I think about leadership as sort of creating the container, the environment to grow others. And everybody's got to find their own path and they've got to learn in their own way. Otherwise, I think your day would be overloaded because everything, it's sort of that hub and spoke leadership model where you notice that everything has to run through you
yeah,
in
yeah.
order to move through. And so by you, pushing that outward and getting behind people and supporting them, I think it's lovely.
Yeah, I think it's a better way to lead, and I think it lets people
Mm,
grow, gives them a chance to
mm,
have a voice and grow. Absolutely. So,
yeah,
so what are some of the keys to leading what I would call a sustainable change? Not something that is, it's almost like a spring. If you push a spring, and as soon as you let go of that pressure, it gets back to its original shape. When we're trying to do sustainable changes, so we can let go of our hand and it stays in that direction. How do we
yeah.
get that sustainable change?
I think that, this is going to sound so cliche, but I think that one of the biggest parts is that it starts with knowing yourself.
Mm,
And, what I was just saying about know where you are today in terms of how you behave. And then more importantly, how you can expand your repertoire. So I think some people are naturally good at getting behind others and supporting, so kind of leading from behind. And I think their work to do is finding the places where they need to step forward and make more moves. And then you'll have just the opposite challenge of there will be leaders who naturally, want to set the direction and want to be, out there making the moves. And their task is to sort of find the way to ratchet it back and let others step forward. So I think first and foremost, it's about, who am I as a leader? What's sort of my center of gravity in terms of how I behave, and how do I grow that and expand it so that I'm capable and effective when I need to be at leading others. So I think that one of the biggest pieces to that is knowing yourself, and then being able to recognize and take responsibility for the impact you're having on others. So I think that concept of, I intend really good. And then sometimes the impact that I have is really not what I intended. And that those two things I think create a lot of dissonance. So those are for me, those are two big keys that sort of set the foundation of making that making change sustainable.
I love it. I love that idea. And making sure that you are, again, it's the intention and the impact. That's something is it's a curious conversation when you have with employees, like, this is what I intended.
Yeah.
How do you what do you see?
Yeah.
Sometimes there's a gap there, even on the best days, even as the best leaders on the best days will miss out on that. And I think
Yeah.
that's an important part, and it's important part to stay curious as to why that is,
Mm,
right? Why am I missing out? And so that makes a lot of sense. And it kind of comes down to what we were talking about earlier, is that you have to have competence in your communication, right? That's a
yep.
big part of what we need to do as leaders, is have good be good communicators. That's a big part of leadership.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think one of the other keys to change is the ability to engage in dialogue. And I think
Mhm.
dialogue's a different kind of conversation. I I think we struggle. I think we struggle, certainly in our organizations to bring that. I think we struggle in greater context to bring dialogue. I think we're really good at monologues. I think we're really good at debate and divisiveness. Um, but I think the key inside organizations that are really wanting to bring about change, if you've got a big vision, I think it's part of that. Can you balance the advocacy and inquiry? And can you engage in a really different kind of conversation, like a conversation where we all are going to learn something, including the positional leader? So we're quite passionate about dialogue being part of that.
That's interesting, because I think we do end up, if I look back at my history, we do end up spending a lot of time in a monologue situation, right?
Hmm.
I mean, we're like I do all employee meetings every month. We get everybody together. I tell
Yeah.
them how things went, right? But one of the things I always try to do is to have, like, I used to have a monthly, we used to call it a birthday meeting, where whoever's
Mm,
birthday was in January, you all come in a meeting, and then I sit around and I say, we ask questions. How do you think things are going this month? What questions did you have? And it's meant to be a dialogue. And then
mm,
we would write the minutes of that and post it, so people who weren't there could hear what that dialogue conversation was. But
yeah.
even that, I think it was a little staged. But I think, to me, always the best time was spending time in the
Mm,
workplace of my employees and listening to them and having them ask me questions like, I heard, our goals now, 30% growth. How do you think we're going to do this? And so they're
yeah.
getting a chance to process this monologue that we might have given, like our goal for
Hmm.
the year.
Hmm.
Like, how do you think we're going to do it? You said something about an acquisition, or who are we looking at? What kind of companies are we looking at? So you get a chance to get a little bit of, I don't know, you get a little more fine detail when you have a
Yeah.
dialogue versus a monologue.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, in its truest sense, dialogue is we're able to bring some of the most difficult, complex things that we might be facing in business. And in that context of dialogue, like we're able to solve. mm, I want to be careful because I don't think it's about sitting down to one conversation and saying, hey, let's dialogue and solve and solve the problem, this really difficult problem, in the next hour. But I do think that dialogue as a practice over time is where some of the learning happens in an organization, and it's where true change starts to take place. Like we go from, I'll give you a really great example, and I see this happen. It's a repeated pattern in leadership teams where, often a leadership team gets formed by there's a person from this division, marketing and production and sales. So you have a group that comes together and they all sort of have their area of expertise or the thing that sort of they're bringing to the table. And a lot of leadership teams really struggle with doing anything collectively because they're all sort of speaking from I, like, in my department, we need to do this, and in my group. And so one of the adaptations that we work a lot with leadership teams to do is look at the we version of that. Like your leadership team really needs to be showing up and engaging in a conversation where we're talking about what's best for the whole. And that, when you do that, and people are able to enter that conversation from a space of we versus I, and that happens repeatedly every time that team gathers. Now you're on to something. Like now, actually, things that felt so difficult between, you know, two heads of two departments that just couldn't see past the thing that they kept debating, all of a sudden now, like the energy changes and they're able to navigate really complex, difficult things, spaces where they hold different points of view. And they're able through that dialogue to actually shift their perspectives and their thinking so that all of a sudden now, after a series of, dialogue episodes or conversations, they think differently about it.
Yeah.
And it's really
Yeah.
not that big of a deal. So I think there's a space that we could really do more of that.
It's interesting you say that because I think oftentimes we forget that we, as the senior leader, we have
Mm,
a leadership team, but it's never a
mm,
team. It's always a group of individuals. And part
yeah.
of our role is to make sure that group of individuals is actually a team.
Yep.
If we want to demonstrate the team leadership we want to have in the organization, we start with our own leadership team and make them a team, not a group of but a
Yep.
group of we. I like that a lot. It's a really important thing. And I would say the best businesses I've ever run, that leadership team, we were lockstep in
Yeah.
trying to achieve the shared objectives of the business. And
Yeah.
everybody had a part, like I'm marketing, I have my part. I'm production, I have my part. I'm quality, I've got my part. But the goals were the shared
Yeah.
goals that we had as a business. And when you have that, I can tell you it's a much more powerful way to lead a business than, like you
Ah,
said, the department heads running off and
yes.
going after doing things almost to hurt each other,
Yep. Yep.
taking an order for a product we don't have, and engineering has to scramble to come up with a design, or
Yeah.
production being late and hurting our prospects for a new order. The
Yeah.
sales department, everybody has to work as a team to achieve the shared objectives. And when you do that, I think you have a much better chance at success.
I say a lot of times leaders bring the weather. And so when that's happening at that team, that you can count. One of the things you can like you can count on the fact that that is also happening across the rest of the org.
It's
So when
exactly it.
that team can't come together, it's like the energy around it will be fighting fires and solving. I Some leaders were sort of negatively refer that to that as I spend my whole day solving drama or interpersonal challenges, and I think it's just because there's lots of reasons that'll be happening, but it's people have been pitted against one another, and they're not. So I go back then to the core. The core of that happens in how we're communicating with one another, and how do we first change that, and how do we start at that top, and then let it trickle through.
I often say that leaders need to lead themselves first, but you've got me
Mm,
thinking that we should say, leaders, you need to lead your leadership team first.
yeah,
Make sure they're
yeah,
a team and they're actually working together, because as you say, that's going to carry out throughout the organization. If there's infighting in the leadership team, I can guarantee you there's infighting down at the shop floor
absolutely,
level, in the marketing department, in the sales department. They're all doing the same thing because that's what they see as the right approach. So
yeah,
yeah, that's a
I
great,
agree.
great, powerful story.
Mm,
Um, what about culture? So culture is one of those things that's it's the shared norms and values. It's how we do things here.
Yeah.
To me, that seems to be a very difficult thing to
Mm.
change. Do you have some ideas as to what are some of the keys to actually, getting some lasting culture change in an organization?
Well, I still think it comes back to how we communicate. So,
Mm.
our ability to engage in conversation and to be able to talk about those things. So, a lot of times, we'll help leaders onboard a way of naming and noticing when they have what we would call model clash. So, when we keep kind of repeating these same patterns, um, I'll give you an example in a leadership team. Some of that was happening where two different divisions were really battling it out between one another. And what was sitting behind that were beliefs that each of them held that were being rewarded by the organization, but beliefs that each of them held about what the other unit was doing that was wrong or wronging them in some way. And so there was a lot of like finger pointing, back and forth blame. And so when we're able to give leaders a language for naming, I see what's happening here. We're creating assumptions. One leader is speaking more from a place of taking action, another leader is speaking more from data, and they're just absolutely talking past one another. So we help them start to unpack and give them a language to help them unpack what that sounds like. And then they're able to start changing things in the moment in their conversations. So I still hold this belief that if we're trying to change culture, and many organizations are, it still starts with the way we communicate with one another. And I think the secondary belief that we hold about that is that people do not change until they feel heard and understood. And again, we have a way of dismissing, somebody has a concern and we have a really good way of just dismissing it. Put it in the suggestion box. We'll get to it never. Tell your boss, and we'll put it in the employee, survey, or we'll survey our company and do nothing about it. So I think we have all these mechanisms for kind of giving lip service to it, but again, the ability to engage in that dialogue. And it doesn't mean that people are going to be right, but it does mean that people are going to leave those conversations going, okay, I, I get where we're going, and I feel like my concerns were heard and people understand where I was coming from when I said them. And I think that equipping leaders with the ability to do that is super important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, from practice, one of the biggest culture turnarounds I did was in a manufacturing plant, my first
Mm,
manufacturing plant. And one of the things we did was a thing called Fridays on the floor. And so every
mm,
Friday, I started out with just me. I would work for 4 hours on the first Friday of every month. I worked in a different department, and I would just get to know the people. They would get to know me. I would listen to their concerns about the equipment or the procedures or
mm,
what have you. And so I was like just seeing their world completely from their
mm,
viewpoint. And I got so excited about it. Eventually, I had the entire management team doing it, and so we would do this every week. Every month we'd be in a different department. But then we would come back after 4 hours. We'd come back. I'd bring in lunch, and we'd talk about what we learned. And then we started taking action on what we learned.
mm.
So this procedure is wrong. We've got too much scrap in this area. People don't understand why they're plating this part or whatever. We found all these
Yeah,
things we had to work on, and then we
yeah,
started fixing them.
yeah,
And what the employees saw is that management is listening, management's taking action. They
yep,
they care, management cares.
yep,
And the other thing is too, they got to know us and they realized what we were doing all day long, because most of the time the people on the shop floor had no clue what we were doing in our offices all day.
yeah.
I looked like I was drinking coffee and on my computer all day, right? I
Right,
was actually
right.
doing something doing something important. But I think they got to
Yeah,
understand me and I got to understand them, and then I
yeah,
think we built that dialogue and we changed that culture together. And I
yeah,
think that's where, again, the dialogue, the communication was really opened up. But I really do like what you said. It was about the action, putting action to
hmm,
requests versus saying, "Oh, put a request in the suggestion box."
yeah,
That's just blowing it off, and that's not listening. That's not caring.
yep. People
Yeah.
get tired of it. They get tired of giving feedback. They get tired of being asked for input. And one of the things that I love about the story that you're telling is that I think dialogue bridges. I think it bridges differences. I think it bridges understanding. It creates doorways for greater empathy on both sides. Like, a leader who's making up stories about why someone's not performing and thinks of them as an underperformer, and that person feels it, and vice versa. The leader who is being perceived as doing nothing but drinking coffee and sitting on their computer all day. So I think dialogue creates like it lowers rank and hierarchy, it bridges differences, and it creates doorways for empathy. And I think you can do tremendous amounts of change. But you have to like once you have that foundation, you can take all kinds of action. You can get all kinds of support that you'd never get without it.
I love it. I love it. Such a
Mm,
powerful part of communication is dialogue. So I'm
mm,
glad that you're bringing that up, and because I think it is an important issue for leaders.
mm.
What final message would you like to leave with our listeners right now?
I want to elevate dialogue. So I think like if you find yourself, I don't care what it is, like if you find yourself challenged by something in your leadership, I would say find a way to look at your communication first. It's not the answer to everything, but I do think it's the place you start. And you get that in order first, and then I think the other things can fall in place.
Well, fantastic. That's a great way to wrap up this episode. Communication, focus on that dialogue. Are you having the dialogue? Are you reaching out to
Yeah.
your people? Are you having that back and forth? Are you curious? Such a good message that you've left with our listeners today. So, how
Mm.
can we find out more about you, your company, and your books?
You can connect with me on LinkedIn. You can find me at Marsha Acker. The book you can actually find at buildyourmodel.com. You can also get it from Amazon. And you can find us and our work at teamcatapult.com. And we just actually, so I've been quite passionate about helping leaders connect with this idea of what it looks like to develop communicative competence. So if you go to our blog, it's called teamcatapult.com/leaders edge. I've just released this week a 7-part series. It's a fable story of a leadership team kind of grappling with what dialogue looks like. So it's actually a story,
Wow.
a little fictitious. But yeah, if you're kind of scratching your head going, what is all this communicative competence thing? Check out teamcatapult.com/leaders edge.
Oh, that's great. Fantastic. We're going to put the links in the show notes for all those resources. But again, look at that fable. If you've been struggling to understand what we're talking about in terms of communication, Marsha's got it laid out for you in a
Yeah.
story. And we know a lot about storytelling in this podcast. We've had a lot of discussions on it, so we know stories are powerful. So
That's
we're going to put a
awesome.
link to that as well. So check out the story, check out the fable, learn what we're talking about when it comes to communication.
Mm.
So, Marsha, this has been fantastic. So, congratulations again on such a phenomenal piece of work and such a great addition to the leadership community with your book. And thank you for coming on the show and sharing all of your knowledge and your
Uh,
experience.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that's it for today. Thank you for listening to Deep Leadership. If you like this podcast, please subscribe and share so we can continue to build a world with better bosses. Until next time, this is John Rennie saying take care and lead well.